so this is our second session on anger. And last week we talked about emotions and whether emotions are good or bad. And we talked about, the fact that anger is something that God gave to us, that it could be good, it could be bad. And so pretty much for the rest of the time that we're talking about anger, we will be talking about unresolved anger, okay? Because what's the unhealthy anger is the unresolved anger. So anger in itself is not bad, but when we don't resolve anger and when we don't recognize the underlying hurt from the anger, then anger becomes a destructive force, and it's not what God has intended, all right? But we want to start to recognize, this lesson is about how do we recognize if we're angry or, what's going on underneath the surface. So let's think about what are some of the words that we use to describe how we're feeling in general when we're talking about, bad feelings, okay? So there are some things that we say that are clear expressions of anger, okay? No questions asked. If I say I'm mad, outraged, infuriated, sore, indignant, I'm acknowledging there's anger there, okay? However, I find that a lot of times we use words that we think describe feelings that are not anger. And we use words that are in expressions of feeling, these words that we don't equate with anger. And when we're doing that, we tend to be deceiving ourselves, and it makes it harder to deal with what's really going on, okay? So I'm the first to admit that I did this, and I probably still do this a lot, but we use words like I'm annoyed, or I'm impatient, or I'm irritated, or I'm upset, or I'm frustrated, and we don't connect those words with anger. And one of the things I like to do when somebody is, when I have a client with me praying that I'm praying with, when they start to use some of these kinds of words, I always like to just check with them and say, you realize that you're angry. And some people do, but most people, like I was this way, I would say I'm irritated, but I didn't think that was anger, okay? And I have a whole list of synonyms for anger that, oh my gosh, I have a whole list of synonyms for anger that are on the resource page that I've shared the link with. I'll have to put the link under the YouTube, under this page on YouTube. But in this link, and I, of course, can't find my synonyms, but there are a lot of words. If you go to the thesaurus and you look up the synonyms for anger, there is going to be a whole bunch of them. But some of the ones that I think, I call them euphemisms, because basically we don't think that those are anger words. Things like, so if you hear things like acrimony, animosity, antagonism, enmity, fury, hatred, that's anger. But when you hear words like exasperation, and ill humor, or I'm miffed a little bit, or maybe I'm peevish, or I'm peaked. Some of those are synonyms for anger, but we have to recognize that is what we're talking about. We're talking about anger. And so start to monitor yourself and think about what are the words that you're using to describe how you're feeling, and ask yourself, is this one of those synonyms? And is what I'm really feeling, is that anger, okay? So some of the other ways that we want to identify anger is kind of like, what are the physical symptoms of anger? So in his book, Deadly Emotions, Understanding the Mind, Body, Spirit Connection, Don Colbert writes that that physical pain can be a sign of anger. Hostility and anger are directly related to pain in a number of people. The Bible says in Jeremiah 15, for you have filled me with indignation. Why is my pain perpetual and my wound incurable? So the Bible has already connected indignation, which is one of those words for anger, with pain, okay? And indignation is, of course, can be a righteous anger, but maybe it's not, it depends on, what's really going on underneath the surface. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by underneath the surface, okay? So some of the physical symptoms that you can have when anger is your problem, you can have chronic back pain, okay? You can have tension headaches, migraine headaches. Okay, we talked about shame, by the way. I think one of the things we talked about was some of the physical symptoms you can have from shame. So, I mean, when you have a lot of negative feelings in general, they are going to work themselves out in your body if you are not acknowledging them and dealing with them and resolving them. So again, anger is one of those emotions that can work itself out in your body. You could have eczema, you can have colitis, ulcers, asthma, or hay fever. And ulcers, I mean, I think ulcers is pretty self-evident that ulcers can be caused by anger, okay? When we speak of a person who is troublesome, irritating, annoying, or emotionally painful to us, we sometimes call that person a pain in the neck. And you might actually have a pain in your neck from somebody who causes you to be angry. We also say things like we break off a relationship with someone, or we have a sorrow or loss. We say we have a heartache, and you can actually have heart conditions coming from anger, okay? When we have emotional pain that is suppressed, again, it can become a physical ailment. We can also, obviously, we also have emotional reactions to anger. Remember, last week we talked about the anger iceberg and what was beneath the waterline. And if you're trying to ward off the emotions that are under the waterline, and you've stuffed your emotional response, you can tend to express one or more of the following, okay? And these are some of the emotional reactions to anger. Perfectionism. Okay, I may be repeating myself, but I think it's worth doing. Those who stuff emotions try to keep everything perfect in their lives so that there will be no cause for them to experience rejection, failure, or criticism. So you're trying to avoid hurt and you become a perfectionist. Again, a desire for control is another symptom, emotional reaction to anger. And most of these people are because they're stuffing their emotions, okay? Remember that we talked about feelings are not to be avoided, feelings are to be embraced and to let us know that there's something going on. But when we stuff emotions, it's usually an attempt to control every aspect of our life and the lives of the people around us. So that no stray emotion has an opportunity to erupt or display itself. We might become cynical or critical, and we avert attention away from ourselves and onto others because, again, we're trying to avoid rejection, hurt, or emotional distress. Okay? Sarcasm, I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but sarcasm is definitely an emotional reaction to anger. And that is defined as the use of irony to mock or convey contempt. So for instance, somebody says something to you that the obvious answer is no, and so you say yes. And of course, if you say it sarcastically, and sarcasm has a very cutting and biting kind of humor, all right? Passive-aggressive behavior is a classic symptom of anger, and that is defined by displaying behavior characterized by expression of negative feelings, resentment, and aggression in an unassertive way. So for instance, that might be procrastination, it could be stubbornness, it could be an unwillingness to communicate. Danny Silk writes in his book, Keep Your Love On, I'm going to describe what he says about passive-aggressive communication. By the way, that was also one of my very favorite methods of expressing my anger, was just to be passive-aggressive. The passive-aggressive communicator's core belief is you matter and no, not really. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand it. They manipulate and control others through active deceit. Sorry, something is happening with my Google Drive. I'm just going to ignore that. Okay. They manipulate and control others through active deceit and subtle but deadly forms of punishment. To your face, they say, oh, whatever you need, absolutely. Then after your little disagreement, they head outside and key your car. The passive-aggressive communicator is famous for sarcastic innuendos, veiled threats, the manipulative use of scriptures, judgments that come in the form of counsel, and withholding love. So that might be the silent treatment or, those kinds of things. Passive aggressive behavior is very, very damaging. And it is, sometimes we just don't know if the person is being passive aggressive. But when we start to recognize that, they're zinging us, it's kind of like they do these zingers, these little things that don't on the surface look bad, but it makes you feel bad. To me, that's passive aggressive behavior. We could talk a little bit more about that in the discussion time. Victimization. How can you possibly get rid of your anger when your anger is simply a justified response to stuff you have no control over? Bottom line is you are a victim. So the result is bitterness, okay? And it's a constant reminder that somebody owes you a debt that they have not yet paid to you, all right? Elijah House says that most people who have a problem with anger have made inner vows not to be angry. And so that's a really interesting thing. And again, I might be repeating myself, but a lot of times we make these inner vows and they backfire on us. And when you make an inner vow, you're saying, my father was angry or my mother was angry or some person in my childhood hurt me with anger. And so I will never be angry. And so you may end up being angry all the time, or you may not be able to be angry, but the inner vow will definitely backfire on you. All right. So what are some of the visible signs that you're struggling with anger? Okay. I want you to think about these things and see whether or not any of these pertain to you. All right. Irritability. You're constantly irritated by all the situations and circumstances that perhaps shouldn't be bothersome to you. Everything irritates you, okay? So you're just completely irritable. Impatience. When you're angry, you have a reduced tolerance for the weaknesses and limitation of others. And an angry person often demands an instant response to their instructions, and they become upset if their instructions are not understood and applied. By the way, these visible signs of anger issues, some of the things that I've been talking about, a lot of these I've got from the Institute in Basic Life Principles, which is, if you go to the resource page that I've recommended, you will see some of the links for some of these articles. And I'm just kind of going through some of the things that they note. Raised voices. If you're raising your voice constantly, and you're having a harsh and a loud voice, that means that that's probably a sign that you are dealing with anger. It's kind of like when, your husband yells at you or your wife yells at you or somebody yells at you and you say, are you angry? I'm not angry. Well, they're angry. Okay. Glaring eyes, anger affects the facial features and empowers a penetrating glare, pronounced frown, tense facial muscles, enlarged pupil. I mean, basically you can see the person is angry. I mean, in cartoons, they will have they exaggerate these things in cartoons and the eyeballs will pop out, when somebody's angry, but we do it. Okay. Hurtful words. An angry heart tends to spew out unkind words of complaint, hatred, ridicule, and rejection. Explosive actions, of course, you just throw things, you start to push things around, you're slamming doors, you're just doing all that kind of stuff, and you're not saying you're angry. And, somebody might say, are you angry? And I'm not angry. And then you slam the door behind you. These are kind of explosive actions that you're just you're expressing your anger physically. A relational breakdown can be a sign of your anger, because usually an angry person closes their heart to the people that have offended them or hurt them. And you can do that by silence, poor eye contact, or simply avoiding the person. You're still angry. You might exhibit an attitude of superiority if you're angry, because wounded pride can stir up contentious anger that motivates the person to challenge the opinions, ideas, or instructions of others, especially of those in authority. So you're in a classroom setting and you're maybe angry at authority in general, or you might be angry at the person who is an authority right there, and you're constantly challenging what they're saying or doing. And, this can come from anger. Physical tension. Anger actually causes the jaw muscles to tighten, which brings great pressure on the teeth when they come together and leads to clenching or grinding one's teeth. Anger also causes a more rapid heartbeat. So anger's release of adrenaline causes the heart to pump faster and veins to become enlarged. That's some of the stuff I've got from the Institute in Basic Life Conflict, but I want to share a little bit that I got from Tim Fletcher's teaching on anger and complex trauma. And so interesting, he really talks about different types of anger. And when I wrote my book, Healing Shame, one of the things I mentioned in passing is how before God started to work on me to help me to heal my shame issue, he actually worked on my anger issue, because first he had to show me that I was angry. And, I saw my passive aggressive behavior. I saw how I was using sarcasm. I saw how I was using those other, acceptable words for being angry. And it was pointed out to me, and then I started to deal with it. But the interesting thing is that when I wrote about it, I was trying to describe what my anger was like. And I'll read to you a little excerpt from my book, because when I was facing my issue with anger, I realized that my anger was subterranean. It was like a lake of lava boiling deep at the bottom of a dormant volcano. If anything would touch its surface, it would flare up and burn the source through sarcasm, biting wit, and resistance to authority, covered under a thin veneer of dedication to duty. The nuns, and I went to Catholic school for 12 years, the nuns had taught me well that it was my duty to obey my superiors, no matter how much I despised them for what I perceived as weakness or incompetence. But I could point to my actions and say I had submitted. However, my attitude and body language screamed, I owe it to you as my boss to obey you, but boy, I will make you suffer in the process. This hidden anger was uncovered when, as part of our study group, and when I was doing my counseling degree, I had to participate in a process group. We had to learn how to share our true selves and let others see our blind spots and confront one another in love. And I was stunned when the group members confronted me with the truth that I was passive aggressive. And I had the habit, because I had this habit of using words like frustrated, annoyed, upset to describe how I was feeling when I was angry. I had learned over time that these were acceptable words to use in Christian circles to effectively mask my anger at family members and authority figures. So I thought it was really interesting. I mean, I described this as lava, and I said a little bit later on that when God healed me from this, that I found the difference when I got set free from anger between trying to be loving and being loving. Once the process was complete and my anger was resolved, I didn't have to work to hold down the anger every time I had to deal with certain people. There was nothing to hold down. It was as if the mouth of the volcano had been opened wide and refreshing rain had doused the remaining lava below. And all that remained were ashes that were easily blown away by the next fresh wind. So imagine my surprise when I was listening to Tim Fletcher talk about types of anger, and he said that there's two types of anger, and the first one, and that the type of anger is this lava, okay? And I was like, whoa, he's using my metaphor. He says that the lava is this underlying anger that's always there, and it's bubbling and simmering below the surface all the time. And he said that was anger number one. But then he said anger number two is the expression of the anger. It's the eruption when the volcano erupts. And he talks a lot about, and I'm not a medical person, medical people here can give me better advice, but apparently when we get angry, we get this release of cortisol. and it's like an adrenaline rush. And that was intended to be able to use anger as a good thing to help us to resolve something, to realize that there was something wrong, had to be resolved. We'd get this rush of cortisol, and then we would say, oh, there's something that needs to be resolved. And then we resolve it healthfully, and then your cortisol levels go back down, okay? But when you get this cortisol level going up all the time because you're constantly angry, that's what was mentioned earlier. It's like you have this adrenaline rush that's going all the time, and it affects your body because your body is not supposed to be having constant adrenaline rushes, all right? And he mentioned that most anger management courses focus on the eruption anger and how to control that. But then he talked about people who are coming out of complex trauma, because remember that if you're coming out of complex trauma, you have been hurt all throughout your childhood by so many things that were happening to you over the years, that your anger has not had a chance to be resolved. Your anger possibly was not able to be expressed in a healthy way and dealt with, obviously, which is to resolve the anger. And so what happens is you have this lava. The main issue is this lava. And unless you deal with the lava anger, you're going to keep having eruptions, no matter how many anger management courses you take, no matter how many anger scriptures you read. If the lava is still there, you're going to have eruptions like I was always having, which was this lava was always in my heart. And it was anytime something would just touch it, I mean, you can just picture what a flare looks like and an eruption looks like when the lava just has something that causes it to erupt. Understanding the lava is the main way to help us to understand and to deal with anger, okay? So he talks about 4 ways that anger is expressed. And, by the way, you may think that because you don't have these eruptions, that you don't have the lava, and that's the way I was. But we all express anger differently. And so there's different patterns he talks about of the ways that we express anger. The first is the obvious thing that we see, the explosion. You have this verbal explosion of nasty, harsh words, screaming, yelling, or you have a physical explosion where you're slamming things, breaking things, or maybe lashing out violently at someone, okay? The second way to express anger is to deal with anger is to stuff it, okay? And that's the one that usually leads to these health issues, okay? You learned early on that if you expressed anger, you got punished for it. So instead of being able to express your anger, you suppressed it. And these emotions are what damage your health. Okay, so they are seeing, as we mentioned before, the connection between anger and heart problems and even possibly cancer. A third way of dealing with anger and expressing or seeing how your anger is expressed is you turn that anger on yourself, because if you have not been able to deal with the anger properly or allowed to deal with it, you start to think that the anger is your fault. It must be something you did wrong, okay? Especially when you've had parents that have told you that you are the source of their problems. And so they're critical, and they basically tell you that you're never going to amount to anything, and you're harming them, you're harming the people around them. And this critical parent's voice from childhood becomes the voice in your head, and then you stop being kind to yourself. And this is very common with people who've grown up in trauma situations, all right? The fourth is kind of the way that I dealt with it, and he calls this the underhanded, the subtly expressing your anger. You're not even aware that you're doing it, okay? So you use sarcasm, which he calls sneaky anger. You pout, you use the silent treatment, or you give one-word answers, like people, are you angry? No. Are you happy? No. Are you this? No. Or you withhold love, or you make sure you know exactly how to push the buttons of the person in your life, okay? And you make it the other person's problem. It's not you, it's everybody else, all right? So for instance, you know that your spouse likes to be early to arrive wherever they're going. Like my husband always likes to be early to the movies, so instead of me being on time, I'm going to hold him back. I'm going to take my time. I'm going to do things, and I'm going to make sure that I'm in a very underhanded way. I'm going to make him angry so that the anger then becomes his problem. Okay. So it's like I'm unconsciously punishing the other person. And so it's when we start to see these, the explosion again is the obvious way of knowing that you're an angry person. But we need to start to see, are we stuffing it? Are we turning the anger on ourselves? And by the way, the definition of depression is anger turned inward. So doing that anger, turning that anger inward is going to can cause us to go into depression, not necessarily. But then this underhanded one is the sneaky way. And this is my personal belief is that I feel like in Christian circles, I was a Christian, I was a Sunday school teacher, I was a deacon, I was in the choir, I was doing, leading Bible studies. And yet I had this underhanded anger in my life. And nobody would have ever pointed it out to me until I was in that situation where, people were really being honest with me. But I just find like in Christian circles, it seems to be acceptable to use this underhanded kind of way of expressing my anger. So I'm going to stop there. I think next week we'll talk a little bit more about anger, and I'm going to ask you to start to think, what does anger look like in my life? Do I have this lava seething underneath? Do I use sarcasm, or am I the explosive one where it's obvious that I have anger? Or am I stuffing it? And so I want you to go to the Lord and start to say, Lord, would you shine this light on what's going on in my heart? Or perhaps, if you're brave enough, ask some people who are close to you who know you, am I an angry person? Or do you see anger in me in any way? So I pray blessings for you today as you start to look into this to find out whether or not anger is your problem.